I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and today's going to be a fun episode. Tourmaline is the best-selling author of a new biography that I've really been looking forward to, and it's Marsha. And it's a biography of Marsha P. Johnson. And Tourmaline, I'm going to ask you, because I do think there are some listeners who might not know who Marsha is, and I'm going to ask you to introduce her to listeners, please.
So Marsha, I started learning about and archiving and sharing the life of Marsha P. Johnson 20 years ago. It's hard to believe how fast time flies. I moved to New York when I was 19 in 2002, and it was right after I was hanging out on the Christopher Street Piers in the West Village with my community of young people who were queer, trans, gender nonconforming, people of color. And it was in that context I started to hear this name, Marsha, all over the place. Who is this Marsha? And it has been a 20-year beautiful gift and journey of getting close to this person named Marsha P. Johnson, who was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey, moved to New York City, Times Square in 1963, right after high school. That's where she met a 13-year-old future incredible activist, Sylvia Rivera. They were building a life together in the midst of such intense repression and violence in New York City against trans, gender nonconforming people. Marsha then had a really pronounced and particular role at the Stonewall Uprising of 1969, which that is where the quote-unquote gay liberation movement really took hold afterwards. And then she created an organization named STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, with Sylvia Rivera in the occupied basement and of a New York University student center. And she was also a performer. She performed 2 times a day with the Angels of Light and the Hot Peaches in downtown New York City. And she was a caretaker. She was someone who was always making sure that she was extending her hand and her care to her entire community. In July of 1992, she died. Her body was found in the Hudson River. And she has left this big, beautiful legacy that so many of us are joyously tuning to, that ensures that her life, though she is not in her body anymore, her life is larger than ever.
I mean, Marsha's story, part of what I love about Marsha's story and the way you tell it is it's a story of community.
It's a story of community.
She does brush up against celebrity, too. I mean, Andy Warhol did do her portrait.
Yeah, she marched down to Andy Warhol's office and demanded her portrait was taken. Yeah.
And it's a piece of art that I love, too, because she just has this sort of way about her. But I also, you're a biographer, you're a filmmaker, you're also a community historian. And this is the piece that I also find really interesting, because sometimes biographies, it's really easy to get caught solely in the details of one person's life. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Marsha and what you've done here is the context that you've been able to layer in. Some of this archival material is not easy to get a hold of. There's a photo section in here that I'm so excited for folks to see. Because, again, this is pre-cell phone, right? We were not...
That's right.
1963, you are not documenting your life.
That's exactly right.
Disposable, even the tiny, remember those disposable cameras back in the day?
Yes.
You would take them around and then drop them off to get the film developed. It's not like that. Photographs, film was expensive, cameras were expensive, you had to treat them a very special, all of these things. So the idea that we still have access to a lot of this material is really kind of special. And you spent a lot of time chasing down first-person interviews and the archival material and, things like the Village Voice.
Yeah, that's right. So
whole piece.
Yeah, Steve Watson, who is still alive, such a huge supporter of the community and of the book, did these really beautiful in 1979 interviews with Marsha P. Johnson. It was 10 years after the Stonewall Uprising. He was wanting to do and he did. He made a beautiful profile on Marsha. And, Marsha's singing in the audio. She's singing one of her Hot Peaches song to the tune of the Trolley song. She is just talking about her life and how being marginally housed and living in the bathhouses also affects her capacity to perform, right? So when she doesn't have a house, she can't put together her looks. And She's also talking about going up to the Midtown department stores and getting her makeup done. And it's just so incredible. So, there's incredible, Marsha imprints in the archive. It has been a thrill to move through different spaces and receive the care of people who came before me, like John Kearns, who was an academic writing about Marsha, Anoni. My sibling Che Gossett, Dr. Che Gossett, was a huge, for years and years and years, supporter of helping me access different archives. And there's a maybe 2 hour long WBAI interview of Marsha in 1973. It's not online. It's really hard to access. And she's just, talking with her friends. All of the members of Star are in the studio room. They're talking about being evicted, but they're also talking about their relationship with their dogs and their cats, and how, because they can't have children, that kind of care goes to, non-human animals. And it's just beautiful, and it blows my mind. Yeah.
So you get to New York in the early aughts. You're 19, you're going to college.
Yeah, that's right.
You're figuring out what your story is in terms of who you're, college is a moment for all of us to figure out what's next. I mean, have I used my college degree? Well, I mean, I learned how to read a lot very quickly and process a lot of information. It has been hugely helpful in my life.
Yes.
Do I use my degree on a regular basis? I would argue I do not. But that said, I really enjoyed college, and I really had a good time figuring things out. But did you ever expect to become a historian? Because that's essentially what you do.
Yeah, I was writing about Marsha. So Robin D.G. Kelly, who blurbed the book, was my professor, and I was his research assistant. And I wrote about Marsha's legacy and the ongoing activism. And this was 2005. I was writing about this. And I was in awe of people who were just kind of tending to the flame of our history and our past. And in high school, I made a class that was taught for students of Black history and Black studies. And I was just, that's kind of, I was really going hard with the history. And so to me, it's been really beautiful in order to walk and move in Marsha's path and legacy, to merge art, which I do, and then also the history, and create like a new secret third thing, as we say.
Describe the secret third thing to me, because I love this idea that your history feeds your art and your art feeds your history, because, I mean, to me, it's all story, right?
Yes.
Like, there's some story with there's story with documentation, and then there's the story that's based on experience and documentation, right? Like, nonfiction, fiction, okay, we can.
Right.
But this idea that you pull from all of these different places, right? Like, one of the fun pieces of reading Marsha is not only do we get the landscape of New York, which obviously the city has evolved like mad, but we also get fashion, and we get music, and we get some food, and we get all of the things that make us people. But it's also fun because it brings it alive in a way. Like, I didn't know about Marsha's performance pieces. I sort of knew more of the history and more of her background than I knew about the performance art. And certainly I knew the Warhol portrait because...
Of course, yeah.
But for you, where do you start when you're researching someone like this? Because again, there's the stuff that's sort of wafting around, right? That maybe it's apocryphal, maybe it's, and Marsha also, I do want to talk a little bit about sort of the way she told her story.
Yes.
Sometimes there were some, inconsistencies, let's call them.
That's exactly right, yeah.
But at the same time, she's still who she is.
She's still who she is in all of those spaces, turning the volume up on her life. And, it's really beautiful to think about, she was an incredible activist. So while she was organizing with Star around, simultaneously access to gender-affirming care in the 70s and a demand for free tuition at NYU and free childcare, right? She had this broad analysis. She was also doing her performance work. And she, one of the most incredible parts of being in the archive is listening to someone like Sylvia Rivera, who is an iconic activist herself, talk about, seeing Marsha on stage and going to that performance 4 times in a row and how it blew her mind. And so to me, that is the secret third thing. It's worlding, right? We are kind of dissolving the binaries between performance and activism and history, and we're actually creating these immersive worlds where we're allowed to dream beyond the harsh conditions. That's something Marsha was so good at. In the early 60s, she was renting these hourly hotels in Times Square, and they would talk about, Sylvia and Marsha, how they were just places to dream. They were asking each other, when might we be free, and how might that feel for ourselves? And so to me, it's like the secret third thing are, in that Robin D.G. Kelly sense, the freedom dreams and our capacity to align with them and move in the direction of them so that we're transforming and transmuting and offering a world to each other and ourselves that we deserve.
There's a lot of joy in this book.
Yeah.
There's a lot of joy. And I think, certainly that does not diminish the reality of a lot of, uncomfortable, unpleasant things. We're not diminishing that in any way, shape, or form. But I think to deny the community's joy would also be a mistake. Because I think, when I look at Marsha and when I sort of look at all of the things she was able to accomplish being very much herself.
Yes.
Very, very much herself. She was not interested in what boxes people wanted to put her in. She was like, here I am, and you can accept it or you cannot. And that is really not my problem, but I'm going to go dance now.
That's right.
There is so much to be said for that, right?
That's right. Yeah.
More of us should probably learn how to do that, though I say that as a Bostonian who can't really dance. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I want to talk about influences beyond Robin D. Kelly, great historian.
Absolutely.
But again, you are pulling from film, you're pulling from books, you're pulling from history, you're pulling from all of these different places. So how do we get you as the creative talent that you are? Who are some of those folks who've built you into Tourmaline?
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of it is, it spans so many different mediums and it has an underpinning vibe of joy. So Marsha knew that in joy, she had a level of clarity that she didn't have when she was kind of more guarded and pinched off. I think that's a reason why joy is important. She knew that she couldn't also be in joy every day. Sometimes she was feeling really hopeless, and she knew that in her righteous anger, she would feel a little bit of relief from her hopelessness. And so I think all of that spectrum is incredibly important. It's important to remember, there's no hierarchy, but joy, we have our access to turning problems into solutions. We have our access to clarity. And Marsha knew also that ignorant people didn't get to determine how she felt about herself. And that was joyful. Your ignorance, your laws don't get to decide how I feel about me. And that's what she modeled. And so for me, my influences are people who do that all the time. I was writing a lot when the Beyonce's Renaissance Act 1 was coming out. And that just had, and Beyonce's offering portals all the time into the past, into worlds that are lush and alive. And now with Cowboy Carter, it's also I remember, I was coming up in a era where comedy, Black comedy, was everything, whether it was Della Reese or Eddie Murphy and Richard Pryor. That had a profound influence on me. Harlem Nights, it's a period film with Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy, but it's also Black humor and comedy. And to me, the levity in that is so joyful. Looking at culture and art, some of my work is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in its collection, and it's on display in the Afrofuturist period room, right? Which imagines a world where the historically Black neighborhood Seneca Village wasn't razed and demolished to make for Central Park. It was allowed to thrive. And so to me, people who are thinking in this lens of Afrofuturism, whether it's Adrienne Marie Brown or Alexis Pauline Gumbs, those are folks that also have deep influences on me as well.
I love all of that. Why can't we have a foot in the past and a foot in the future and our brains in the present? I mean, I think you can actually do both, right?
Yes.
I don't want to lose my sense of history. I mean, you and I are both from Boston in slightly different ways, but at the same time, that's a place where you learn history, whether you want to or not. History is on every corner.
Revolutionary,
right? And some of it is great, and some of it you're like, that's really the story,
right?
Really,
right, exactly.
That's the story. I mean, there was that huge molasses flood, and where this would happen nowhere else. 1916, Boston gets flooded by molasses, but at the same time, what do you do with that history? Right? How do you open the door and bring more people in to a shared history, to a way of looking at the world that can be more inclusive than otherwise? And joy kind of is that piece, right?
It's the key. Joy is literally the key.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's what I learned through writing the book, and also for spending, 20 years and receiving the gift of Marsha P. Johnson, is that, joy is the key. And also in knowing Marsha, we allow ourselves to know a constellation of people who cared for Marsha, that Marsha cared for. We allowed to see the fullness of someone's life. When I started learning about Marsha, I was an organizer and activist, and I wanted to know who came before me. And I was talking about things like historical erasure, which are so real. And now I think about Marsha's relationship to spirituality and her conversations with God, and how that really underpinned her joy. She knew that when she was having a kind of close proximity to who she really was in that spiritual sense, she felt joyous and she felt clear and grounded. And so to me, I think that is the lens through which I approach history.
I do think, too, having read Marsha a couple of times now, that
Thank you.
Her sense, oh, no, really, it was a joy. It was a treat. It really was a treat. Her sense of responsibility towards others who were less fortunate. And she had some moments where life was not easy for her in any way, shape, or form.
Absolutely.
And her siblings, though, sound great. Her mom sounded like mom was doing, mom had some generational stuff, but like her siblings were absolutely there in ways that I was just really happy to read. It was just
the Michaels
really nice.
family is alive in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And, I think a couple days before the book came out, I've gotten to know them. I met Al, Marsha's nephew, 15 years ago at Judson Memorial Church in Washington Square Park. And I've just been so blessed to get to know this beautiful family and share, how they are so deeply tending to the legacy of Marsha and Marsha's aliveness. Yeah,
I really love that, and I really appreciate it. And also, Elizabeth, New Jersey is not necessarily a place you think of as being on the front lines of a lot.
That's right.
And I say that with respect. It's a lovely community, and people are home there in wonderful ways. But when you think of sort of where stuff happens, you think New York City, you think Los Angeles, you think Miami, Chicago. Elizabeth, New Jersey is not necessarily, and I love this idea of sort of a quiet revolution, right? Like you can have your family, right? And you can have your own sort of, you don't have to be constantly doing a thing. You can just be. And I love the idea of Marsha and her siblings just being like, well, here we are.
That's exactly right. You can just be. And I think that's a gift of Marsha. So many people were influenced by Marsha simply just being.
Yeah.
They would get off the subway and they would see Marsha simply just being. And they would have a profound realization that they too could simply just be. And that would certainly transform their interiority. And in that, it would transform the people around them. And in that, it would transform a community in the world. So simply just being is a truly powerful act. Also, it was really beautiful to learn about the kind of underground drag scene in Elizabeth, and Billy's Tavern. And I like all of these places that you associate more with New York, but actually were very much part of the fabric of New Jersey.
And again, I really appreciate the fact that we can have all kinds of communities in all kinds of places.
That's right.
Right? Like, I mean, just home is different for everyone, right? And I feel like Marsha had created a sense of home for herself that may not have been conventional. And she certainly is the center of a very big found family. And, some of that was also, I'm going to flick you on the ear because I'm mad at you, sibling.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, here she is saying, it's not here, I'm going to build it. The thing that I'm looking for. And to be able to do that in a position, and again, she's not rolling in cash. She doesn't have a huge, I mean, in some cases, there are moments where she's unhoused, all of this kind of thing. And yet she's still saying, well, but it doesn't mean that we are without value. And I am without value. And I think that's a really important thing to remember that we assign all of these sort of different values to status things, right?
Right.
And Marsha was kind of like, well, you can try and make me think that way, but it's not going to happen.
No, she was an innovator. She ushered into the world things that had never been seen or experienced before. And that was so powerful that, also I love how, she had this great capacity to make it personal. So she took over New York University and did a beautiful occupation.
I love that story.
Like right after the Revolutionary People's Conference in Philadelphia, they were so inspired by what was moving through mass consciousness at the time. And then also she was like fighting for access to gender affirming care. And then she spoke so openly about how it made her feel when she was accessing hormone replacement therapy. And she had a level of joy in her voice, talking about, my breasts are a handful. They're the biggest handful. And you can tell, that kind of gender euphoria that Marsha was moving with, that I think so many people can relate to, who are trans or gender nonconforming and accessing healthcare that we need. I was a part of the campaign in New York to fight for access to gender affirming care in under Medicaid. I was a lead organizer in 2014, and we won. New York State had a specific provision that denied transgender nonconforming people access to healthcare under Medicaid, and we simply said, well, actually, when we have access to the healthcare that we need, our suicidality goes down, our mental health goes up, and we're able to live authentically and fully. And, with what's happening nationally in the tax bill that, intends to disallow transgender nonconforming people from accessing healthcare, I think looking to Marsha as an architect of a movement that was navigating very similar harsh conditions is really helpful, because I think right now without it, some people can feel unmoored or lost or afraid, and all of that makes sense. But Marsha is here to say, I navigated the same things, and we can transform the world.
Did writing this book change you?
Absolutely. It deeply changed me. I think I found myself just wanting to be fully open to that Marsha magic message, right? That we can usher in conditions and care that has not been seen before. We can innovate. Marsha was an innovator. And so I found myself, just veering more in the direction of, just because something hasn't been done before doesn't mean it's impossible. And that deeply, deeply changed me.
I think sometimes it's hard to remember that hope is an action.
Yeah.
It's not kind of a thing that you just sit around and think nice thoughts about. Like you have to actually convince. Sometimes you really have to convince yourself.
That's right.
And I think it's a really important point that you're making, that 1963 was actually not that long ago, and yet. And yet,
that's right.
It goes back to these cycles, right? In American history, I started rereading that giant Arthur Schlesinger book because I feel like, and also I think it's mandatory reading. When you grow up in Massachusetts, I think we all get assigned it in high school. Like, it doesn't matter where.
We really do.
I think it is
a few texts like that. Exactly.
And they hand it off. And I didn't remember it being so gigantic when I was a teenager. And maybe they just gave us like part of it. I don't know. But I have a new copy, and the thing, it's like a
so big. Yeah. Oh my goodness. What are you recalling from that experience of reading it right now?
Mostly, honestly, it's just this idea that, I'm not imagining things. It is cyclical. It's like every time I think we've gotten to a certain point, and, I've had a version of this conversation too with Nicole Hannah-Jones, and, it's, humans are funny, right?
Yeah.
We're funny. And sometimes we are really good at moving forward, and sometimes we're like, eek!
Yeah, totally. In some ways, it feels that the world that like Marsha was ushering in, and that so many of us have gotten to be transformed by or reproduce or we were produced in, is unstoppable. It's like, while there are increased forms of resistance and legislation, and, like transgender nonconform people are all of a sudden in kind of a zeitgeist moment than before, it isn't, you can't put it back. I think that's also what some people are responding to. It's like, we actually experience the sense of ease and freedom. There's no going back to a smaller understanding of ourselves.
When you're making other forms of art, right? Like you've done film, you've done visual art. Like I think there's something to be said, and I know I mentioned this a little earlier in the show, that you pull from all of these different places, right? Music and film and everything else. But the idea that you as the creator get something bigger out of doing a piece of visual art, right? Yeah. And here's the book where you've got to balance your voice as the author with Marsha's voice and all of the chorus of voices around her, right? Because you want to make sure you're doing right by your subject.
Yes,
by the period, and also by the reader. I mean, you have, when you're a biographer, you have an obligation to the reader to make sure that you're getting everything right.
That's right, yeah.
So I'm assuming there's a balance of freedom for you as the writer or the artist where you get to play a little more when you're doing the visual thing. And you've done a short film about Marsha, a short fictional film. But same thing, even there, I feel like, well, you've still got a little more room than you do on the page. Yeah?
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think, with a moving image, film, visual, there's a bit of play that happens in spontaneity, right? Where it's like on set, you might have an impulse to change the shot or have the character say a particular kind of thing or have the story move in a particular way. And writing, I started writing Marsha in the summer of 2020. And so it's been, 5 years pretty much of being so immersed in this project. And while there were impulses that came to me in terms of directions to go, it is a different kind of process.
Your editor, who I'm very fond of.
Yes, Emmy. She's amazing. Yeah.
She's great. Emmy, but where does your agent come into the process when you're working on a nonfiction piece, right? You still have to structure the book. You still have to figure out what the narrative arc is, because we've all read books where if you're missing a narrative arc, you have a problem. Writing a book, though, people have this idea that it's just you at a table or you in an archive. Totally. But I mean, when you hand a draft over to your agent, I'm assuming your agent has inputs before you send it to your editor. And then, so what does that process look like for you when you're sort of shaping this work? Because again, it's very different from the visual art where you're just like, I'm making a thing. I have done the film. I'm taking film out of the equation for a second, but like the visual art sits here. Yeah. But a book is kind of a different animal.
Yeah, a book really is a different animal. I think part of what was a blessing is the slow, steady pace of it all, because you get to really consider, is this the right direction? There's so many ways that different chapters were written and rewritten, kind of pulled apart and put back together. I think about, the Stonewall chapter and how important it was for me to add the context of Marsha's memory and how trauma affects our bodies and and how we recall. And add the full context of Marsha saying that she remembers Stonewall being in August on her birthday, and that doesn't reflect our collective memory of when and then, my dear friend Leah Lakshmi's profound offerings of, riots not being neurotypical, sane events, right? And the importance of approaching Marsha's life with a lens of disability justice and disability activism. And Marsha herself, was disabled and was accessing mental health services and also lived with a bullet in her back for over 11 years and was a HIV positive person. And she was building that community of care. And so to me, it was really important to have that from the get-go. And then also, Emmy is an incredible editor, and my agent Bridget is, just a profound agent, and really, it really is a constellation of people who create a text like this, over many, many years.
I want to talk about nostalgia for a second, because every community has nostalgia. And sometimes nostalgia is a cute thing, and sometimes nostalgia is not possibly the best direction forward.
Yeah.
And like I said, every community has nostalgia for something. And I'm curious to know how the response has been. Because, I mean, there are some people who have known Marsha's story for a long time. There are other people who are coming to her as newbies because they just, I mean, there are young people on the planet who are just not around. And the way we tell stories, you know, changes and ebbs and flows and everything else. But I'm curious if you've been surprised by the response to the book.
Yeah. You know, I have been. I've been really moved by it. And people, you know, like through this process of 20 years, I was able to get very, very close to people who knew and loved Marsha on a daily basis. And so whether it was, you know, working with Michael's family and Elizabeth, we're working on a documentary about Marsha as a hometown hero, and that's been years in the making, or Augusto Machado, who was a contemporary of Marsha's, and Augusto's, you know, still performing, you know, performing at La Mama. Yeah, it's incredible. And so, and Augusto just being also a caretaker for our past, but also wanting to remind us that all our power is in our now moment in time. Just like Marsha was navigating things that caused her to innovate, we are. And so we want to have our, you know, powerful focus on this moment and what is it asking of us? What is it, you know, prompting us to create? And so it's powerful that Augusto is still performing and creating in that way. You know, Randy Wicker, who lived with Marsha for a decade. I met Randy, you know, before I met Al Michaels, and I've just been the beneficiary of Randy's incredible generosity. You know, and Randy archived letter after letter. And so Jimmy Camicia, who is Marsha's director at the Hot Peaches, there's just the list just goes on. And so, yeah, I've just been, it's been a blessing, honestly.
I also love that generational shift, right? Like the knowledge gets passed along, and that way we don't, because I mean, for years, that's how different communities have, like, not every story was ever written down, right? Like, and there are even languages that are purely oral languages.
That's exactly right.
Have a written form. And so you've got to tell your story from person to person. I'd like to hold the door open and be like, hey, there's come hang out.
That's exactly right. Come hang out. And so much of it has been just these, you know, like going to different people's small New York City apartments where, you know, like everyone's stuff is here and everyone has a cat, and I have a cat, Jean, and it's just been so magical. Yeah, that part.
Did anything surprise you as you were writing this book? Did Marsha surprise you? Did the community surprise you? Did the people around her surprise you?
I think I was surprised. You know, I knew Marsha was a performer, but I was surprised about the extent that was a real kind of foregrounded, consistent aspect of her life. And one of the motivations of why she moved to New York in the first place. She wanted to be a Broadway star. When she lived in Calabasas, you know, before the Kardashians in Los Angeles. And I got to go there, and there's a beautiful olive tree in the house that she was in. And she went to the MGM studios, which I now think is owned by, you know, a different company. But she walked onto the lot and was like, give me a job. I'm a star. You know, and she was auditioning. And so I think to me that aspect of, okay, this is a artist very, very committed to her craft and to having it evolve and moving with that evolution. I think that really surprised me. And, you know, also Marsha was like talking about, you know, like had an expansive political imagination. And in the 90s, she was, you know, making very clear statements against the early 90s against the first war against Iraq, and you know, and being like, we're going to Kuwait for the oil, you know, and in that kind of Marsha accent, and that felt incredible. And then also her like real conversations with God and her proximity to the immaterial, and that felt also really beautiful.
What do you think Marsha's legacy is going to be?
Yeah, I think it's unfolding in a really delicious way right now, honestly. You know, it's the dreamers, the people who are, you know, doing their version of being in those hourly hotels, asking and imagining what could be true and knowing profoundly that it is possible. It's the people who are extending and receiving care and mutual aid. It's the people who are performing, whether it's in the street, you know, like the naked cowboy in Times Square is Marsha's legacy. All of the performers, you know,
Is that guy still around?
You know, I have to double check because
Okay.
we haven't heard of him.
It's been a minute. It's been a minute. But
he's on sabbatical.
I haven't thought about that in really long time.
Literally. But it's all of these kind of street-based performers. You know, Marsha was there in the 60s doing street-based performances for the Times Square, you know, theater goers. So it's the fashions, you know. She was so committed. You know, she talks about her fashion years. You know, like a designer might talk about their collections of years past, and it's the music, you know. So yeah.
And she didn't repeat if I remember correctly, she did not
she wasn't repeating the outfits. Yeah.
When she performed. And so that requires some storage space in New York City, as you
real
well
storage
know.
Space. Exactly.
That is not a small commitment.
It is no small commitment at all. Yeah. It's a real commitment.
So what's next for you?
Yeah. So I published Marsha alongside a children's book One Day in June, which is about kind of tuning to the aliveness of Marsha's legacy, whether that's giving someone, you know, a little bit of mutual aid money or stepping out in a fabulous outfit. To me, Marsha's story is so cinematic, so I'm really excited to explore that again. And yeah, that's part of it. Okay,
Tourmaline, you and I could hang out for another hour and a half, except literally, you've got some history to write and some art to make, and I've got some books to sell. So this is where I have to say, this was excellent. I'm so glad we got to hang out, and I cannot wait to do it again. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.